Good afternoon to you, Lord Finkelstein. Thank you for joining us. Written a column in today's Times called "Ceasefire Supporters Fail to Understand Israel." This is coming off the back, of course, of calls from Sadiq Khan, and now 350 Labour councillors have written to Keir Starmer demanding the same. Can you explain to us, please, Lord Finkelstein, why these people simply fail to understand Israel?
Well, I've written a column about the film Exodus, which was a book that came out in 1958 originally, led to a film in 1960 by Otto Preminger, which starred Paul Newman. And it's a romantic vision of the foundation of the State of Israel. And of course, you could look at it and think, well, this is a bit hackneyed. It doesn't include all the nuances. But it helps explain how Israel looks at itself and also how Americans look at Israel. It's a vision, I suppose, of Israel's foundation and why it sees itself as a last refuge for Jews. That there had been violence for centuries against Jews, and now Jews were going to protect themselves. And so those people who are calling for ceasefires don't appear to me to comprehend that Israel is simply not going to live next door to a terrorist state that threatens its civilians. It would go against the essence of what the state of Israel is. So it's not merely absurd for Sadiq Khan, who cannot even end knife crime on the tube, to be lecturing everyone about how to solve the problems of the Middle East. It's also pointless because Israel is simply not going to allow the growth of a terrorist body right next door to it.
And as you wrote in your column, security is the biggest thing for the state of Israel, and that is why a ceasefire cannot happen.
Before the Second World War, my grandfather was not a Zionist. He was one of Germany's leading anti-Zionists. He really believed that Jews could live in Germany, and what happened to his family, the death and destruction that was wrought upon it and the rest of the Jewish community, changed his mind, naturally enough, about whether or not a state was needed. Once you've decided that really the part of the solution to the problems that Jews have had of safety in the world over centuries is the state of their own, and you've also realised that's the only place to which millions of Jews really could go after the Second World War. Once you've determined on that, you aren't going to allow a state to exist next door that threatens that security. So, I mean, I watched Sadiq Khan speak and say he recognised Israel's right to defend itself, immediately before which he'd said there should be a ceasefire. And you wonder what planet that kind of statement comes from, really, because how can Israel defend itself and also have a ceasefire, leaving in place the structure of terrorism? And Keir Starmer was much more clear thinking about this. I think he's, my translation of this is he took a reasonably strong stance to begin with. He then saw that there was quite a lot of opposition in the party. He was a bit shaken by it, but he's come back to his original view in a fairly bold way, and I was quite impressed.
You write very movingly in your family memoir, your own mother was rescued from the hell of Belsen and found safe haven in Hendon in London. Lord Finkelstein, when you see today a 650% increase in anti-Semitic crimes in London, when you see Jewish schools have paint thrown on their doors, when you see Jewish children too afraid to even wear their blazers to go to school, how does that make you feel?
Well, it's frightening and worrying, and I write right at the beginning of my book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, my story of what my parents suffered in the Second World War from both Hitler and from the far left, from Stalin. I write about my concern that this could happen again, and it's one of the motivations for writing the book. But when my grandfather Alfred Wiener was one of the first people to warn about the rise of the Nazis, he first started warning about this in 1919, so well before anyone else had really begun to do that. And you can see in that some of the seeds of some of the things that we're seeing, this kind of growth of conspiracy theory thinking and a growth of populism and the dangers to Jews of those moves. But the other thing that you get is a sense of proportion. My very strong feeling is we live in one of the best countries in the world for someone to live as a refugee family, and that's what we are, and we love this country for the peace and tolerance and stability we have, and we want to protect its special qualities.
And do you still stand by that? Do you still think that this is one of the safest places for refugee families? Do you feel as though it is peaceful for those who are seeking refuge? Is that how you felt in recent weeks when you've seen the pro-Palestine marches?
Well, no, I am shaken by those, and I'm shaken by, actually, my reaction to, for instance, the takeover of Liverpool Street Station yesterday, by these groups was two things. The one thing is I was worried about it as a Jew. I don't think that it would be safe for me to go to Liverpool Street Station in the middle of that demonstration, which is very concerning. It's one of the first times I felt that in this country. But the other thing that I felt was furious on behalf of most ordinary commuters who don't have a strong politics like I do, who don't, spend their life writing columns in the Times, and who were interrupted in their journey home by self-aggrandizing people expressing their political opinion and asking the commuter going to Cambridge to call a ceasefire in the Middle East. And you just sort of think, well, they're not really going to be able to do that before they go home. So I did find that extraordinary, and I do think it's amazing that we now have these rolling demonstrations of a vast kind without any thought about the inconvenience it puts anybody else to. So of course people have the right to free expression of their political views, and political demonstrations are very important. They are, however, only one right. The right to go home after you've been to work is also a right. That also deserves respect, and there's a tension between these rights. And I was a bit surprised that we allowed the station to be taken over by people, involved in a conflict most people have no stake in at all, quite apart from the fact that, for me, it was certainly quite frightening to see. And imagine this. You can imagine that for me, or particularly maybe for some people who, for instance, might wear a skull cap, which I don't do, and who are therefore more visibly Jewish than I might look, they might find that a very disconcerting thing. So to be fair, there weren't reports of violence, but then again, to be fair, probably nobody who was at risk went anywhere near the area.
And Lord Finkelstein, in your column today, you also reference a scene in Exodus where the hero Paul Newman celebrates the idea that Jews and Arabs will one day live in peace side by side. After the events of October the 7th and what's followed subsequently, do you hope or think that that's still possible?
Well, Paul Newman delivers that speech over an open grave of an Arab and a Jewish girl, an Arab man and a Jewish girl who've both been murdered in the very earliest days of the conflict. What a tragedy this is. And from the beginning, there has been the possibility of Jews and Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, living side by side, both having a state. Israel has repeatedly offered that to various incarnations of Palestinian leadership. It's not possible to offer it to Hamas because that would be like offering it to ISIS. It's not possible to do that. So Hamas and their infrastructure does have to be fought. But I think it's possible to have peace. My grandfather was a considerable scholar of Islamic literature. And he thought this wonderful civilization was something that Jews would benefit greatly from living alongside. And I feel the same. I think this fight is an absolute tragedy. But the only way that it can be brought to an end is for both sides. And in particular, this is a call upon all those people who say, Palestine from the river to the sea, something that you can also hear an echo of in extreme fundamentalist Zionist circles too. This is just not a route to peace. The land has to be shared. Everyone has to be able to live in peace alongside each other. But let's not be wishy-washy in our thinking. Before that can happen, the Israel is going to now have to deal with Hamas and is going to have to destroy its infrastructure, its tunnel system and its leadership, because there's no peace for anybody, Palestinian or Jew, until that happens. And the people who are camping out in the stations and having these big demonstrations, they always know what Israel should not do. What it's a disaster for Israel to do. They never say, what should Israel do about the fact that this invasive force came into its country, killed 1,500 people in most grotesque way, civilians in most grotesque way. And they say, as Sadiq Khan did, Israel has the right to defend itself, but never say how. And therefore that they leave to people like me the moral responsibility for how, and simply object to those methods. Well, that's just, it's very lame thinking, to be honest.
Lord Finkelstein, just before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about more expected protests this weekend, pro-Palestine marches in various cities, a large one expected in London. We've heard Suella Braverman talking about them this week, describing them as hate marches. But Sir Mark Rowley of the Metropolitan Police says words like jihad, and the chant that you just said on air there, certain chants such as that, he says he can't police good taste that isn't within their scope. How do you react to that? How would you like to see this be policed?
Well, actually, look, I think all three of us would be strong advocates of free speech, even when it disturbs us. So when I review any demonstration or any statement, I prefer it when the police err on the side of thinking something is a matter of political taste and judgment rather than a matter of law. But I have to say, if someone threatens jihad, it is ridiculous to regard that as not a violent threat. It's meant to be, and it is. The question of whether or not people should say Palestine from the river to the sea is a different matter. But I do think there's a question of proportion here, and whether or not we ought to, that it's reasonable that people hold these vast, very partisan, and to Jews, whether rightly or wrongly, quite threatening demonstrations, whether it's right to feel threatened or not, can be held week after week in the central London, making central London effectively a no-go zone for Jewish people. That is, I am a bit worried about that. And I think it's right to ask that question. And there's a balance to be struck between people's rights to protest and the right of other people in the light of their protests taking over large parts of the city.
OK, Lord Daniel Finkelstein, thank you very much.